What's up? My name is Ken Dumbo, the MC with the sauce. Don't forget to subscribe to J. Cool.
Good day and welcome to today. We are privileged today, as earlier announced, that we are hosting Dr. Chirwa. We are looking at the state of our economy. Let me just introduce briefly. Dr. Chirwa is the chair of the Department of Social Sciences and is an associate professor of political economy at the African Institute Global Studies University in the United Arab Emirates. He's also a member of the Purple Commission on Debt and Development Crisis in the Global South. Remember, the late Pope, set up a commission that should advocate debt write-off and debt cancellation for poor countries and highly indebted poor countries. He is privileged to be among the few African economists that sit on that commission. The commission was convened by the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences at the Vatican. He has also been recognized by the African Report. The African Report is one of the credible publications, and he's been recognized as one of the top 10 African scholars to watch for in 2025 because of the various publications that he churns out on Africa, on global state of the economy, and even on Zambia. Before joining the Africa Institute, Dr. Chirwa served as Director of Research at the Institute of Race, Power and Political Economy at the New School. He was also a senior lecturer in economics at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business, where he directed their MB program. His academic journey includes being an inaugural postdoctoral fellow at the Center of African Studies at Harvard University. So we have a very distinguished economist amidst us who's going to review the state of the economy. What is the state of the economy? Many people acknowledge that it's at its worst, that the World Bank recently revised us as one of the 6th poorest countries. We are among the top 10 unequal countries in the world in terms of income inequalities. We have a rising debt. Remember, it was $11.9 billion as at 2021. It has been taken to over $15.4 billion, and with arrears it goes up to $18 billion. We have rising local debt of worry, local debt. In 2021, the local debt stood at $178 billion. It has ballooned to $236 billion. The government talks of fiscal prudency, that they are very prudent. In fact, today, another economist, Dr. Lubinda Habazoka, claimed that he would give President Hakainde Hichilema 9 out of 10 for his fiscal discipline. Rising debt, you are putting supplementary budget in the same year of another $2.5 billion. You have not plugged issues of corruption, and you say fiscal discipline. And here we are facing one of the worst cost of living crisis. Many people are saying literally in living memory, our people can barely afford their salaries, income are static, but the cost of living since 2021 has gone high and high. It was worse in 2021, but it has become far worse than it was in 2021. Then power cuts and load shedding, it just imperils our people from doing business, from living normal lives. Life is very expensive because if you put things in the fridge, they'll go to waste. And the alternative, solar and other alternative sources like generator sets, are very expensive. Like now, there's a huge diesel shortage. So how do you even run your alternative power supplies? So, and then there are concerns in every sector. But President Hakainde Hichilema says he's doing very well. He actually gets surprised when people saying he's not doing well. Let me just give you a view of what President Hichilema has been saying about the economy before we bring in Dr. Chirwa.
We acknowledge. Today is a great day for Zambia. is a great day for our people. This Zambia debt has been choking our country, been choking our economy, choking our social sector. Today, we've been able to formally sign off on what we call the Zambia debt restructuring. This means a lot. It means we now have some relief. Today we've unwrapped this python and we can breathe. We've created headroom, space to move resources that would have meant to go to debt service. A good portion of it, a very good portion of it, will now go to the developmental needs. Economic development, social development, basically triggering a great opportunity for us to develop this country, which is our flagship campaign promise, to reconstruct the economy, to grow it, take it from the bottom where it was, take it up, and indeed, this opportunity is now being availed. And I ask the people of Zambia, first I thank them for their support, then I ask them to continue supporting us, this government, which is walking the talk. We were never shy about the importance of dealing with the debt restructuring. We made it very clear from day one, in opposition, that this will be our priority. And today we've ticked it off as one of those. As we ticked off Mopani a few days ago. So we continue on this trajectory, on this path. But this is a big one. This is a huge one. Thank you. The citizens of Zambia have actually accorded you with this opportunity to serve them. Bring investors, partnerships. We're looking for cheap capital, we're looking for technology, management skills. For development, the interest of the people of Zambia come first. Please understand that. Once you do that diligently, in a focused way, your own interests will be taken care of. This is the focus. Please make us proud.
Dr. Griff Chirwa, welcome to today's program.
Ambassador Mwamba, it's an honor, pleasure to see you again. I just came back from Lusaka, and you were not in Lusaka, so what a
Wonderful. Wonderful. And I'm glad you are just coming from Zambia. So you just don't have an academic perspective. You have a realistic perspective of the state of the economy in our country. I chose to invite you that we discuss this matter. You're an expert, no doubt. Your distinguished record and academic profile is extremely impressive, and we are proud as Zambia to have sons like yourselves, sons and daughters, highly distinguished, respected in foreign lands, and serving in your capacities that you are serving. So we don't take it for granted. But Doc, let's come to the state of our economy. We are reviewing the 4 years of UPND on this platform. You see, despite the narration I stated of the state of the country, the president is very hopeful. He thinks he has achieved. He's done the 4 years very well and just put the economy on track. So let's begin to review the 4 years. Let's begin with your perspective of the last 4 years.
Thanks, Ambassador Mwamba. I think my perspective of the last 4 years can be summarized as one of great disappointment, one of a missed opportunity for the people of Zambia, I think. And the reasons why, and I'll go into reasons why later on in this program. But when I look at the facts, Ambassador Mwamba, having come back from Zambia, having spoken to people on the ground, having interacted with the working class, having interacted with the working poor, and then all sorts of other statistics that one can adduce, one is led to conclude that the last 4 years really have been one of disappointment. And again, it's very important for people to understand that when we are benchmarking President Hichilema's administration, we don't benchmark it against the administration that was voted out. We benchmark it against the promises the promises that he and his party gave to the Zambian people. So it's on that basis, Ambassador Mwamba, and I know as we go on talking that I'll produce the statistics and we'll have a conversation about exactly what I mean by a missed opportunity. But really, the last 4 years are one of a missed opportunity. The big thing is the debt, for example. I mean, this is the big issue. This is the big issue that brought President Hichilema into office. One of the major issues was the debt. And that was one of the major issues that he sold himself on as his ability to be able to do something about debt, to bring about debt restructuring. But as I can share, in terms of statistics, for example, and these are statistics from the Ministry of Finance, right? So I'm not making these statistics up. These are statistics that have come from the Ministry of Finance, most recently in July of 2025, July of this year, in a town hall meeting that was presided over by Secretary to the Treasury, Mr. Nkulukusa. And in that particular town hall, for example, he did tell us, right, the president, remember, made a statement just in the clip that you played that we have succeeded in restructuring our debt. That is half true, right? Half true because Secretary to the Treasury in Nkulukusa, in his town hall meeting last month of this year, did say that we've only succeeded in restructuring 50% of the debt outstanding. Now, we have an agreement in principle with 91% of the creditors. It's very important to distinguish the two. 91% of the creditors have agreed in principle to restructure the debt with us. But the actual debt that we've restructured is only half of the debt that we ought to restructure. We've only succeeded in restructuring about maybe $4 or $5 billion of about $11 billion that ought to be restructured. So a pass rate of half, if you only succeed in restructuring half of the debt that you promised you would succeed 4 years down the line, in my mind, Ambassador Mwamba, is not a success. And then there's also the aspect of, okay, we've restructured the debt. What does the future profile of debt service payments look like? This is just external debt, debt that's denominated in US dollars. And again, I use statistics, not that I've made up, not that statistics that I've collected, but statistics that have been provided by Secretary to the Treasury and Nkulukusa himself, the Ministry of Finance. And when one looks at those statistics and one looks at the profile of debt service payments over the next 5 or 6 years, even after what they call successful restructuring, one is left very worried. For example, 2025, this year, we're going to pay about $500 million in debt service payments on external debt. And then 2026, it's going to double to $1.2 billion. 2027, $1 billion, and so on. 2028, I think just about $900 million, and so on. So now, these numbers are important because when we defaulted, the eve of default in 2029, we defaulted in 2020. On the eve of default in 2029, we had crossed the threshold of $1 billion in external debt service payments, and that's what triggered the default. So it actually boggles the mind now that we, even after quote-unquote so-called successful debt restructuring, we're still paying interest payments. We're going to be paying interest payments of about $1 billion per year for the next foreseeable future. Again, in my books, this cannot be referred to as successful debt restructuring, Ambassador Mwamba.
You are privileged that you are sitting on the paper commission that is advocating the cancellation of debt and purely debt write-off. And I saw you presented a wonderful paper, and maybe you can speak to it, at the JCTR in Lusaka, when you were talking about the cost of living crisis that we have. So here we are. A story has been told to our people that debt restructuring is a success, and we are therefore making savings that should go to, to the social sector, where our people, then can be empowered. But you've just provided the profile that in the near future, we're actually going to pay more than we had been paying before. This is extremely worrying. What kind of debt restructure then is it? Can it even be called a success?
Ambassador Mwamba, no, it cannot be called a success. And I think we're now getting into the nitty-gritty of the discussion here. Again, it's very important to keep in mind that we were promised 4 years ago So we were made certain promises. Promise number one was we're going to restructure the debt. Now, in a common person language, when somebody says, I am going to restructure your debt, what I think our citizenry were expecting was that after the restructuring is successful, the profile of interest payments or the profile of debt service payments well into the future is going to look drastically different to what it was before we defaulted, right? In other words, we're going to be paying less interest payments or less debt service payments than we were doing before we defaulted. That's essentially the promise that was given to us. And then in order to convince us to sign on to this plan of debt restructuring, the IMF then went to the IMF. The government then went to the International Monetary Fund, which is now the second tragedy here, because we were then told basically to restructure this debt successfully, it is required or it is advisable that we go to the IMF, and then the IMF will put us on an IMF program, which essentially is going to result in them making sure that we're fiscally disciplined. And then the combination of this IMF program and the plan for a debt restructuring that we have will end up with a future that is better. That's essentially the promise that the UPND government sold to the Zambian people. Now, as I have just said in a couple of minutes ago, what we have is 3 years later, the IMF program is coming to an end, which should mean that, okay, now we have a successful situation, but it turns out that the situation is just as bad as it was before default, or it might even be worse. Because certainly if the only time that we paid $1 billion in interest payments in the history of Zambia before defaulting was 2019. That was the highest level that we had ever paid in external debt service payments of $1.1 billion or some number. That's the number that triggered the default. Now, next year, we shall pay $1.2 billion. 2027, $1.1 billion or somewhere around about there. 2028, $900 million. 2029, maybe $800 million, and so on and so forth. I think up until 2023 or 2024 are the projections that the Ministry of Finance has provided. They can only project up to about 13 years hence from now. Now, these numbers are dangerously high. Ladies and gentlemen, these fellow citizens, these numbers are dangerously high. I mean, obviously, we all know what $1 billion is. It's a big number. It's a huge number. This is why when somebody is called a billionaire, we take them, people take that person seriously, because these are huge numbers. If you think about, for example, the Kafue Gorge Lower Power Station, I wonder how much that power station was costed, somewhere around $3 billion, $4 billion, somewhere around about that. So we'll be paying, for example, $1.2 billion next year, a third of what it cost us to build a power station. In 3 years' time, we would have spent as much on external debt service as we would have spent on building a power station. So these are huge, huge numbers. These are such huge numbers for an economy of our size. And I'm very, very worried that come about 2030 or 2031 or thereabouts, we might find ourselves defaulting yet again. We might go back to square one, which is to say the entire 2020s, the entire decade of the 2020s might very well have been a lost decade for us. Now, and then there's the IMF story, right? So we were sold the IMF story that this is the path to sustainable debt restructuring. But as I have just illustrated, nobody can score this profile of debt service interest payments as a success. On the other hand, what did the IMF do? Okay, so we were willing to make some sacrifices. Let's make a sacrifice by going to the IMF. On the other hand, what has the IMF done for us? One, we have historically high energy prices, both in terms of fuel as well as in terms of electricity tariffs. I just returned from Zambia. The electricity tariff situation is really, really terrible. Really, really terrible. And part of it, again, we were sold. So on the other hand, there was the bit about moving the electricity tariffs to what is called cost-reflective tariffs. But on the other hand, again, we were told the story that if we push up electricity tariffs, we'll sort out the load shedding situation, which hasn't actually happened. So we have very high, we have high fuel prices, which then translates into high transportation costs, which has translated into high food costs. We have a historic cost of living crisis, as you just illustrated, Ambassador Mwamba. So essentially it's a very, very bad situation. And then on the other hand, what the IMF wanted us to do, again, as a prerequisite, so they said, of debt restructuring was to conduct what is called fiscal consolidation, which is really to slow down the pace of expenditure, right? And I was looking at the numbers. I mean, it is incredible the amount of fiscal consolidation that has taken place over the last 4 years. In 2021 or 2020, I think 2021, government expenditure was about 32% of GDP. By about 2025, it has gone down to about 26 or 25% of GDP. These are huge numbers. This is a reduction of around about in the order of $4 or $5 billion. So when you hear people in Zambia on the country, yes,
that point
one
is
second,
yeah, that
yes,
point
go ahead,
is
yes,
very critical. Fiscal consolidation,
yes,
and you are saying the numbers are going down. Just explain in
yes.
ordinary parlance terms what you are saying there. What does it mean? Has this been an improvement, or what does it mean? Sorry to cut you short.
Okay, so essentially, no, I'm very happy, and I feel free, Ambassador Mwamba, to cut me short. Otherwise, I'll continue yapping away and talking to myself. So often, people interchange words like fiscal discipline and fiscal consolidation, right? So fiscal discipline is essentially saying the government is very disciplined in how it spends the people's money. And now, discipline doesn't mean that it is spendthrift, it is stingy. No, it just means that the government is a good custodian of the people's money. They can account for it. They keep records. There is no theft. There's no pilferage. There's no sorts of those kinds. That's fiscal discipline. Often we tend to think fiscal discipline is what is called tightening the belt. That's something else. So fiscal consolidation, right, or fiscal austerity is what the IMF likes. The IMF essentially is saying to our government to say, slow down or even cut back expenditure as a percentage of GDP, right? Cut back expenditure. Now, this is dangerous for a developing country like ourselves, because for a developing country like ourselves, we need to spend. We need to spend investment in infrastructure. We need to spend investments in health, investments in education, and so on and so forth, right? We need also to spend. The government is one of the biggest movers and shakers in an economy. To keep the economy going, it is the lifeblood of the economy. It needs to inject cash into the system via contracting people to build roads, contracting people to do all sorts of expenditure initiatives here and there. Now, what has certainly happened over the last 5 years is we've seen the reverse, right? We've seen the opposite. So in about 2021, government expenditure, this is how much government was spending, was 32% of the economy, 32% of GDP. So we have a GDP of about $30 billion. You can do the mathematics, 32% of GDP. And then by about 2025, that number had slowed down to about 25% of GDP. So the government had stopped injecting some amount in the order of about $4 billion into the economy. So the government had slowed down in its expenditure. And when you look at some of the actual expenditure items where they have slowed down, it's mostly on issues to do with public investment. So to do with infrastructure, right? That's where they have slowed down, which is a very, very big problem. Because if you're slowing down investments in infrastructure, you're harming your ability to generate economic growth and development in the future. By the way, and this is not a number that is meaningless. Walk around Lusaka today, or walk around major cities today, or just walk around Zambia, and you'll hear people saying there is no cash in the economy. That's the direct result of government slowing down expenditure. And then it harms our entrepreneurs, it harms our private business sectors, so on and so forth. So that's exactly what it means, Ambassador Mwamba, fiscal consolidation. To be contrasted from fiscal discipline. I think you did say at the beginning of this program that my elder brother, Dr. Luwinda Habazoka, who I've exchanged ideas with before, was referring to fiscal. The government has been disciplined fiscally. That's a different thing from fiscal consolidation. And I would argue that it's not true that the government has been fiscally disciplined, right? I think we've been waking up every day to all sorts of scandals that suggest that the government has not been very, very careful custodians of the fiscus. Yeah.
The IMF story, Dr. Chirwa, did Zambia have an alternative did we have to go to the IMF? Because it seems like the IMF is a place to go if you are in a crisis we're in. Did you have alternative thoughts? Because the IMF program seems to have brought pain and more pain. and the projections you've now given us is that the pain is for the next 5, 10, 15 years. If we'll be spending more money, on debt, on debt service, there'll be no money available for projects and for our social sector. Was the IMF a route? Did we have alternatives?
And by the way, that's a very good point. And the larger point is all this pain was for nothing, right? All this IMF pain was for nothing. I mean, I was just looking at the breakdown, for example, in the structure of cost of why it is the cost of living has gone up so much. By the way, again, you don't need to be an economist to get the sense that the cost of living has gone up, although economists or statisticians can produce the numbers. Inflation is still in double digits. And I saw, again, I think Dr. Luinda Harazoka talked about inflation coming down. Yes, inflation coming down. The inflation rate has come down, but it's still in double digits, right? So inflation coming down does not mean prices are coming down. Just means the rate at which prices are growing has slowed, but it's still growing very fast and in double digits. And the structure, for example, of why the cost of living is very high. One of the big components of why the cost of living has continued to go up is transportation costs and food costs. These are the two things that are driving the cost of living crisis in Zambia. I mean, if the cost of living crisis was being driven by other things, like, I don't know, luxury things or price of cinema tickets or what have you, I wouldn't care so much because that hits only the well-off. But it's actually transportation costs and food costs. And this is directly related to IMF-induced or IMF-supervised policies, removal of energy subsidies. That's the biggest. Energy, as you can imagine, is an incredible input into the production process, which means, this thing has a knock-on effect on food prices. So those are the two major factors that are underlying the cost of living crisis: transport and food. The thing which the vast majority of our people rely on a great deal. Now, was the IMF inevitable? No, it wasn't inevitable. And it's really due to a lack of imagination. We have a generation of leaders who are truly unimaginative, who are truly unimaginative, don't have an imagination. It's not just President Hichilema and his government. It seems to be an African curse. You see it everywhere in Africa where an African country goes into some type of a balance of payments crisis or a debt crisis, and that country immediately runs to Washington. So we really are having a lack of imagination amongst the current crop of leaders across Africa. The IMF wasn't inevitable. There were many paths, and I think 3 or 4 years ago, I did go on radio and I did say then on radio that this IMF path was going to lead into disaster for Zambia. It was going to be pain for nothing. And now we're living in a situation where the program is coming to an end in October. And I'm sure if you went to the typical Zambia and you said to them, now that the IMF program has come to an end, or at least the 3-year extended credit facility has come to an end, is your life better today than it was in 2022 when this program started? I'm sure the answer you're going to get is no, right? So the IMF was not inevitable. Now, if you recall the profile of our debt, we had many creditors, but one very important creditor was China. Right, I think China was holding somewhere about $4 to $5 billion of $11 billion debt that needed to be restructured. Right, so one can imagine just at the beginning, right when the president was elected in August 2024, had he played his geopolitics right, and had we gotten to China at a time when Zambia was hot property. When President Hichilema became president, he was caught in between the West and the East. Right, he was a very valuable commodity at that time. He should have played his cards right. And I think if we had gotten to China much earlier, and at that time, we could have gotten ourselves some reprieve on this $4 or $5 billion. I mean, there's a lot of literature that shows, Ambassador Mwamba, that China doesn't necessarily forgive your debt, but what they usually do is they might give you a longer payment horizon, or they might restructure it for much longer. Right, and which gives you some room to breathe, unlike what we have now, where we have some of the restructured debt, which is due in 2032 or 2033. China might have given us a much longer time horizon. So that was option one. Option two, for example, and you could do combinations of these options. Option two might have been to issue new bonds. Right, if you recall, when President Hichilema was voted into office, there was an incredible response in the markets. We had a crazy appreciation of the kwacha. I think it went from somewhere like 21 kwacha to the dollar up until 16 kwacha to the dollar. Yields on Zambian bonds declined. So the yields are usually, common parlance would be interest rates. So the cost of borrowing on Zambian external bonds went dramatically low. Right? We could have taken advantage of that situation and issued perhaps one or two new bonds that were going to allow us to pay off the bonds that were falling due in 2020, I think 2022, 2023, and 2025, if I've got my memory correct. And then there was another option, and option 3 might just have been, we say, okay, we're big boys and girls. We've been independent for a very long time now. Almost 60, it was almost 60 years then in 2021, would have been 60 years in 2024. So we're going to put together a strong team of Zambian negotiators that is going to go to each one of our creditors to negotiate a deal that's favorable to Zambians as well as to the creditors. That was option 3, right? And there are many other options that one can derive. In the extreme situation, and this is one that I would not advocate for, but it can use it as a threat. You can have a threat to default. All I'm saying, Ambassador Mwamba, is that there were multiple options on the table that could have been considered. And the president has incredible convening power. A president has massive convening power. It is very easy for a president to convene a panel of experts or a committee of experts, or to do, to give a panel of experts a 30-day period in which to go and study the issue and submit a report. The president has amazing amounts of convening power, and I'd hoped that the president was going to use some of this convening power to be able to help him have much more light on the issue. Right, that's one of the great privileges of being a president. You can do something like that, but unfortunately, we made the IMF inevitable. And I think 3 years or 4 years down the line, it gives me no pleasure or no satisfaction to say that I was largely right. I was largely right that this was not going to be a path that was going to result in reprieve for the Zambian people. This was not a path that was going to be produce a bright future for the Zambian people. And it gives me no satisfaction to say that, Ambassador Mwamba. All it gives me is just some sense of dismay that things could have been done differently. There is no way one can say the last 3 or 4 years of sacrifice are worth it when one thinks about the payment profile that's going to hit this country in the next couple of years. It's going to be, again, much more painful, because where is this $1 billion going to come from? Where is it going to come from? Very likely we might end up seeing some taxes going up in a very serious way to be able to cover some of these interest payments. And then we might end up defaulting again. Losing 10 years, would have lost an entire decade, which is going to be incredibly tragic. And as the last point I'll make before I pass it back to you, Ambassador Mwamba, is that you are very right. If you're going to be paying $1 billion in debt service payments, then watch out what's going to happen to education and health expenditure. In the past, when we have increased expenditure on debt, as we did, for example, in 2019, right before the default of 2020, debt service payments had begun to crowd out. They had begun to take away expenditure from education and health. So again, might very well likely happen, which then creates a vicious cycle. We are underinvesting in education, underinvesting in health, underinvesting in infrastructure, and therefore we shall remain perpetually poor. Right. So this is a tragedy. I mean, it gives me no pleasure to be saying this. And then there's also some other very strange policies that we have implemented with regards to the mines, which is our crown jewels, the gift that God gave us. God gave us a gift to be able to deliver us into development, but we've really squandered that God-given gift. And when one looks at the numbers again, the mining houses have had a field day in Zambia. In this period when the rest of the Zambians have been tightening their belts, they've been facing very high cost of living crisis. We've had big debt overhang problem. The mining houses have been getting away with a field day. I was just looking at the numbers. One of the very interesting things that the government's figures, right? The government has been publishing these figures. When one looks at the figures, for example, corporate income tax collections
Doc,
for mines.
Doc,
yes.
That gives me a rider when you talk about figures. You and I are keen followers of government pronouncements and pronouncements that are coming from the Treasury and from State House. All of a sudden, they've painted a good picture that, look, there was economic growth of 4.5% in 2024, and they are projecting over 5% and 6% going into next year. Do we have a credibility of figures? Because if you look, we've just suffered the worst drought in 100 years, and it affected our seasons, our farming season. You know, we had to feed people, we had to take out a ball of begging and ask for $900 million from the international community. We have faced this load shedding, the power cuts, now going straight into the third year, one of the worst power crises we've ever had. I think in the last 6 years, it has affected small and medium enterprises, even big corporates and companies, because some, for example, that run 4 or 5 shifts can no longer do that because just price of fuel is very expensive. Then you have, for example, the communication infrastructure that has been affected because you can't run sites for 18 hours on diesel. It's just no longer affordable for, for our people to have network. In the midst of this crisis, both the Treasury and President Hakainde Hichilema are saying, no, we are posting growth. In fact, we've got the biggest bumper harvest in history of our country, 3.6 million metric tons, and that now we are posting economic growth of up to 6%. When you hear these figures, especially drawing from the Zambia Statistics Agency, which is supposed to be a non-partisan professional entity, do you believe these figures? Do we have doubt on the integrity of the figures?
I mean, by the way, before I answer this very important question, I want to finish just a point about the generous treatment of the mining houses under this government. So one of the things that we've done is we've begun to treat the mining houses with kid gloves, right? So we've given them, for example, we've done something very strange. We've reduced mineral royalty taxes. Before, in the PF regime, in the last years of the PF government, what we did is we had a mineral royalty tax regime that was very interesting in the sense that it tried to capture as much of the upside. For example, as the price of copper goes up, we get ever more from that increase in the price of copper. With Dr. Msokotwane coming into office, we did two things. We made the mineral royalty tax regime a little bit complicated. So and the complicatedness of it basically means that, in effect, we've reduced the mineral royalty tax, right? So effectively, it becomes lower than it would otherwise be. And then number two, we made mineral royalty tax tax deductible. So it can be treated as an expense when the mining houses are computing their corporate income tax obligations. Essentially, we've given them some part of a gift. So the effective corporate income tax rate then is lower. Now, this has translated, this is not just formulas, but it has actually translated in less tax collections and less revenue collections from the mining houses. For example, I have, if I can just pull up a figure here, you will see, for example, that mining income tax receipts in 2022 were around about 12.2 billion kwacha. In 2023, they had gone down to 5 billion kwacha. This is huge. This is just mining company tax receipts. Mineral royalty tax receipts were 10.4 billion kwacha in 2022, and they had gone down to 7 billion kwacha in 2023. So again, these are gifts that we've given the mining houses, inexplicably so, at a time when we're supposed to be collecting ever more revenue from our God-given gift, given that we have a debt problem, we have a cost of living problem. We have really been treating the mining houses with kid gloves. And the promise was that if we do this, if we give them these tax incentives, they'll produce more and they'll take us to 3 million metric tons by the end of this decade. We're far away from that target. If anything, these mining houses have not responded in the way that would justify these huge revenue losses to the fiscus. Now, when it comes to the question about the credibility of the statistics, right? I have been a very big fan of the Zambia Statistics Agency from as far back as when I started my economics journey, and I've always relied on their statistics without question. Now, it has been a couple of things have happened, for example, that are making it difficult, very difficult to, in a sense, to trust what's coming out of Zambia Statistics Agency. I don't want to cast aspersions on them. There are very many professional people who are working there. But we had a very interesting incident, if you remember, Ambassador Mwamba, that took place at the Mulungushi Conference Center. It had never happened before in Zambia's history. The routine process of releasing census figures. I mean, this is a routine as boring as it gets. The Zambia Statistics Agency every 10 years collects, undertakes a census of housing and population. They figure out how many people are in the country. And then at the end of this exercise, they release the figures. But if you recall, there was supposed to have been a census in 2020. Happens every 10 years, but because of COVID, there was a delay, and so on and so forth. But these figures were only released this year, if I'm not mistaken. And part of the reason why they weren't released early enough is there have been very big major disagreements and big major fights behind the scenes at the Zambia Statistics Agency. And these kinds of disagreements came to the fore a couple of months back at the Mulungushi International Conference Center when Dr. Chole Beani, who I think is a board member or was chairperson of Zambia Statistics Agency, clashed with perhaps the statistician general, I can't remember, but there was an open clash, an open disagreement about something as boring as census figures, right? So it raised many eyebrows among some of us who are consumers of the statistics that come from the Zambia Statistics Agency, and suggested that maybe things may not be all right at the agency. Is there some aspect of political interference? How can something as routine, as boring as the release of census figures inspire such an emotive outburst and an emotive exchange of words at the launch of the census? This has never happened before, and honestly, it raises lots of suspicions. Now, about the growth numbers, there's a couple of things that might be happening here. But anyways, at the end of the day, a couple of things that might be happening here, but it's also important to say, if this growth is true, if this growth is real, right, why aren't we seeing it on the ground? So why aren't we seeing an improvement in wages? Because if the growth is real, if we're growing at 5% over 3 years and so on and so forth, this growth must translate, for example, into an improvement in wages. It must translate into an improvement in the unemployment rate. It must translate, in a sense, into an improvement in the cost of living, right? Into affordability and all those kinds of things. But as anybody who's walked around Lusaka, or walked around Zambia, and as the statistics on the cost of living and so on and so forth, and even some of the sort of statistics that one can glean on employment, and one can glean on things like wages, these things have remained stagnant, if not gotten worse. So where is this growth? Why isn't this growth translating into actual improvements in the quality of in the living standards of our people? And there's also the other issue, which is very strange for me when it comes to these growth numbers. I've read Minister Msokotwane's budget addresses very religiously, since the first one that he presented in September 2021, the second one in September 2022, the third one in September 2023, and so on and so forth. Every time he would make a projection about GDP growth in his budget address, right? A projection about the year that he was giving. For example, in 2023, he would say, in September 2023, he would say, in this year, we expect, let me give a perfect concrete example. September 2024, he said, in this year, we expect growth to be 2.5% of GDP. And yet, it ended up being 4% or 5% of GDP. And now, obviously, there's, you might be making an estimate, a projection, and it turns out something out of the ordinary happens, and then you end up at 5%. But that thing out of the ordinary, to double your projected growth rate, has to be incredibly out of the ordinary. And nothing out of the ordinary has happened to justify some of these growth figures. And there's also the issue that we haven't really rebased our GDP since 2010. So we haven't updated the map or the profile of our economy since 2010. So it's very possible, Ambassador Mwamba, that we're leaving out a very big chunk of our economy when we're calculating these growth numbers, right? For example, we might be leaving out a very big chunk of our informal sector, which, as I expect, has been incredibly hit by the fuel prices, by the load shedding situation, and so on and so forth. And to that extent, then these numbers are really overestimating the actual growth. Because if the informal sector is large, which I believe it is, in many countries such as ours, the informal sector is incredibly large. It might be as large as half, if not greater, of GDP. Then we have a situation whereby the actual growth may be much lower than that which is being officially reported by Zambia Statistics Agency. Now, so this is how I look at this, the story. What I want to, in a sense, yes, the numbers are important. The numbers coming from a statistics agency are important insofar as growth is concerned. But what I really want to do, the smell test, is what is happening on the ground. To the extent that what is happening on the ground is at a disconnect with the official statistics that are coming from the statistics agency, then we have to ask some questions. And part of the questions may be a credibility question, as inspired by what happened at Mulungushi International Conference Center earlier on. It never happened before. It might be an issue that we are just not measuring economic activity properly because we haven't really updated the map of the economy since 2010. It might be just that maybe this growth is there, but it's just benefiting a few elites, it might be benefiting the private sector and not so much translating into broad-based improvements in the living standards of the people. So essentially, at the end of the day, Ambassador Mamba, before I hand it back to you, is to say, if there's growth, it is not showing on the ground. It is not showing on the ground. And I think that's a big concern.
Yeah. We will be opening the lines shortly, and our callers and viewers may have questions for you, Doc. The structural part of our economy, I think we still have concerns. Agricultural sector, energy sector, the changes that have taken place attract not interest but concerns, because there seem to be changes that are promoting corruption. The leakages, the issues around corruption, I think you touched it early, that one of the key promises by the president was to, seal these gaps, that we shouldn't have these huge reports of corruption, these kind of illicit financial flows that have just hit the roof, the kind of even public sector corruption that is being reported. What is your view about this before we open phone lines and invite people to ask you some questions?
Now, I'm not particularly an expert on matters of corruption, but I observe them as an ordinary citizen, and it is very disappointing. I mean, as an ordinary citizen, I sit there and I see these daily headlines, and not just in the tabloids that one may allege opposition, bias towards the opposition, but even in the tabloids, which are often known as the stenographers of the ruling party. And I won't mention that particular paper, but we know the paper that often has has a bias towards the ruling party. One sees these reports in that paper as well. And it's almost as if it's back to the future. It's almost as if we're going back in the past with these kinds of reports. I mean, I've been seeing the reports on the medicines. I saw the other day a report on medicines that are about to be destroyed with millions and millions of dollars. One sees the reports in terms of the FIC reports. The trends haven't changed from before 2021. If anything, the numbers have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. So it is incredibly disappointing. Again, we're measuring this president not against the government of before, against his own promises. And, we have both video, documentary evidence of the promises that he made. We're measuring this president against his own promises. And from that point of view, it is very, very disappointing. I mean, I've been seeing these stories about the Anti-Corruption Commission says they are investigating some ministers, some sitting ministers, and some sitting officials in the present government of potential corrupt activities. And yet we see these ministers are not being named and they're not being asked to step aside for a while, so to pave way for an objective type of investigation. So again, this is very disappointing, Ambassador Mwamba. We did see in the previous government, for example, ministers being fired, ministers being asked to step aside who were corrupt. But in this government, which was supposed to be better, we have hardly seen any minister being asked to step aside. And I can't think of any. Maybe I can think of the one who was Minister of Foreign Affairs. But after immense amounts of public pressure, was this person told to step aside. So I mean, it's very disappointing, Ambassador Mwamba. It really, really is disappointing in that regard.
Another matter before I open the phone lines. When you see the president, first, he doesn't seem to admit that we have an economic crisis. The picture you have painted is dark. The picture you've painted is that we must have a solution that ends pain and pain for our people. But the president and his team are very optimistic, as you've seen on the few videos that I put out. How do you contrast the two? They're saying we're on a good economic pathway, that they've, restructured the economy, and that the economy is growing as it should be, and that, Zambians need not worry, it's in capable hands. You deal with statistics, just figures and facts. You are not a politician. What do you make of this?
I mean, it's incredibly sad because we're doing a disservice. It's the old story of the emperor has no clothes. The emperor is walking around naked, and everybody's pretending that the emperor is actually wearing clothes when they are not wearing any clothes. So it's tragicomic. It's a tragedy. It's comical, but actually it is a huge, huge tragedy. Because if we really did care, if it was really the case that the economy was doing very well, then we should be able to be reporting numbers about, this is what's happening to wages, right? Wages have grown, but all we ever hear is this economic growth number. Which, as I just alluded to a little bit earlier, one has to take it with a pinch of salt. But we should be having some story about wage growth. We should be having a story about employment creation, the unemployment rate. We should see the unemployment rate coming down. We should see the cost of living coming down. Because this economy, when we say the economy, it is not a thing we're talking about which exists outside of ourselves. The economy should be there to serve the people, especially serve the least amongst us. And I think when one views the economy under the HLM administration, again, as measured against the promises that he himself made, not measured against the President Lungu administration or the Microsoft administration, measured against the promises that he himself made, I think we get a situation where the scenario is very tragic. So I'm very, very saddened that we're going around with the emperor pretending to have clothes on when the emperor doesn't have clothes on. So this really is very sad because it's tragic. Reality is not optional. You can't choose to suspend the reality. We're actually doing our people a disservice, right? I wish we could get to a situation where I would say, ladies and gentlemen, we expected this, but it hasn't panned out as we expected, and we would like to course correct. We'd like to change the course of the economy, and we need help, and this is exactly how we're going to do it, etc., etc. But that kind of discussion and debate is not happening. Our leaders are burying their heads in the sand. And as I have just illustrated, the future is going to be very, very difficult. These levels of debt service payments are unsustainable for an economy of our size. So it's very sad, Ambassador Mwamba. I mean, it is sad. Essentially, it is your people are struggling, they're crying, and you're not hearing them. This is what this is. This is what really is the story.
Viewers, it's time for you to call in. I've got very limited time with Dr. Chirwa. We'll try to see if we can take as many calls as possible so that they can answer you. The economy affects you. The economy is the lifeblood of our country. So the lines are open and we'll be listening from you. So, Doc, just hold on. I sort out my phone and that you can begin to receive these phone calls from our people. We have an active set of people that call, and Zambians and abroad usually call for this particular program. Let me just sort out my phone and so that we are on the way. Yeah.
Thanks for tuning in to JQ News. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the latest updates on tech, politics, and everything in between. Until next time, stay cool.